Hey everybody, welcome to another Ryan and Rodrigo. And today we are back with friend of the show, John McCartney. He is back here again after his, now it's basically been voted #1 show, favorite show ever, by me and Rodrigo. We took a unofficial poll and decided that John was our best guest. And so we brought him back, dragged him back again to have some fun. Thanks, John, for coming. How are you doing?
I'm doing delightful. As you can see, it's quite sunny where I am right now. So really having a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, man. And you were coming to us all the way from sunny Seattle, not rainy Seattle.
Indeed.
And the last time that we talked to you, it was a little bit dark and depressing and kind of tense in Seattle, right? Because there were some protests going on. Things were a little bit rough there. How have things turned out with regards to all of those protests that were going on, the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter protests? What was the result of that, at least locally? A lot of the news gets talked about nationally. Has there been any local ramifications about these things just there in Seattle?
I would say locally things are still ongoing. Before the show started, you made a mention of your own family around the Portland area not being as positive about the movement and about the protests over the last year. I'm coming from, I think, the other side of that, where my heart is still with a lot of what we were asking for on the streets before, and we have seen some gains. The conviction of Derek Chauvin was something that can directly be attributed to the pressure of the protests, and it's interesting how we can say on the national level stuff okay, well, that's really great, it's a start, we're not getting anywhere yet, while still being frustrated and annoyed, I guess, with people being on the street. I think it was just last weekend, it might have been the weekend before that, where I was just stepping out of the house on the way to go to the beach with my wife and with some friends, and a May Day protest that was going right by the Starbucks that's directly outside my apartment. There were 14 protesters, and it was met with 40 police officers who proceeded to hold people down and arrest them. One of whom was a cook from a local restaurant who had just stepped outside to just film what was going on, and they arrested him. And so it's these things are frustrating. Within the local news, one thing that's been rumbling for a bit, our mayor has deleted all of the records of her text messages and emails around the time of the evacuation of the Seattle East Precinct Police Department. The head of the fire department, head of the current interim police chief, all have just hidden and deleted their communications from that time. So it's that's a really interesting thing to occur, and yet you still find that your average Seattle voter is more concerned about there being homeless people in the park, and they're oh, I don't like that. But I see there as being kind of these bigger things that are really important, for our city and for our union and things like that. So yeah. That's right.
Yeah, that is really troubling to have your highest level elected officials just hiding information from you.
It's we know she's not running for another term.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I imagine.
A lot of things that I've been hearing coming out of Portland are, like you said, the homeless thing. The homeless thing is like a huge, huge problem down there. And also that the protests, like at this is what I hear, is that the protests at the beginning were in a lot of like good faith, and that they were more focused on the problem at hand, but then they devolved into kind of like a mob mentality, and then they drug on and didn't have really a focus or a demand, and it was just a lot of anarchy and destruction of property. What do you say to those types of comments? And did it happen in Seattle too?
I don't,
Because that's what I heard about Portland.
Yeah.
And
I can't speak to Portland. I wouldn't describe how the Seattle protests went in that way. I would say that, you know, as time went on, like the number of people going out definitely decreased. Something that you can notice in like any organization or community or group structure is like how over time things like drama come up, personalities come into play, people stop getting along. So I know through the others that I know of fallings out between people who got involved, disagreements about the best way to do things. But I wouldn't say that like we devolved in any kind of mob mentality. I would also say that, especially here in Seattle, we kept like a pretty succinct set of demands that were typically like the you know beat for marching, you know, defunding police, reinvesting in the community, freeing protesters, firing the mayor, firing the chief of police, essentially those things. So many of those things are still not true up here, and so that like remains like a pretty stable banner. A couple faces have changed, you know, around town, but we also have like the issue of a lot of people being concerned about the city council member who represents my neighborhood, Shama Sawant, who is a Democratic Socialist. And there's a recall effort that is quite popular here among neoliberals because they don't like her involvement with the protests. You know, she admitted to like a certain ethics violation recently that is like people are holding like some kind of sword of Damocles that is ready to fall and just like chop her out of her position. But I think that like she has done pretty important things to protect workers here, like on Capitol Hill, to protect renters. There is nobody else who has done so much to create renters' rights agreements here in the city. Like literally, we would not have things to fall back on as renters if people aren't, you know, providing hot water, or if they're not like repairing your front door and shit like that. Like problems that really happen all the time. There is like a city apparatus to be like, hey, as a renter, as a tenant in a building, I deserve like this level of like safety and utilities. And yet people are like, well, what's she ever done for the city? And it's like, if you don't like rent and have a job in the city, then you wouldn't, I guess, know. That's why she's a city council person, that people are treating her as though she's this like all-powerful figure that's like ruining the city and ruining the community. And it's like, you know, so much of what's going on, people aren't drawing the lines between different things. You know, that people are like, oh, you see all these like protests, but we've got like the homeless people in the city. It's like, okay, the protests often like involve people who are unhoused. It is true, because they've been impacted really negatively by lots of things that have gone on over the last year. The causes, though, isn't that like these people don't like the police, thus we don't have police. Now dangerous, stinky homeless people are running around everywhere. We have homeless people out everywhere because COVID devastated the economy and because people lost jobs and homes. Like, that's like why this has happened. And so like just it's really unfortunate the way the conversations have gone, because it has been more about like blame, like when you look at the Seattle Times, when you look at Cairo or King 5 or other, local news stations, I don't think that they've focused on the direct causes to the circumstance.
And like with
so it's just complaining about what they see.
With the homeless problem, I've seen a lot of blaming the homeless problem on the fact that the cities in the Northwest have a much softer policy on like drugs. And so because of the lack of drug enforcement in Portland, Seattle, in these cities, that is the real cause of the homeless crisis. And is like,
how?
Because then the theory is, the homeless people from all over the country are flocking to Portland and Seattle because they know they can get away with smoking marijuana. It's like, what are you talking about? You crazy person.
It makes conservative sense.
Yeah, there's so many holes in that sort of thing, from the widespread availability of drugs everywhere,
yes,
to I don't know, to like the lack of material resources to easily resettle yourself in a new place, and ultimately like everything behind those kinds of complaints and the kind of things people say, they just want it out. They just like, oh, just get people out of here.
Yeah.
But it's like, what do you want for them? Do you want them all dead?
Do you want them, is your solution to send them to Chicago? Okay, so get them out of my town and send them to New York. So that's the solution? Really?
The issue is simply saying like, well, we've got an out group and we just don't want to have them here. Is that like when you create no place in your society for people who don't have means, it just means if you don't have like a certain threshold of resources, it's best to just hope you go away as quick as possible. And like, that's not, people who don't have resources don't need our hope that they disappear. They just need some resources.
Yeah.
And the ability and opportunity and means to get those resources, right? Also.
Mm-hmm.
So you said earlier that a lot of the cause of this is the economic disruption, the economic crisis caused by the COVID pandemic. And a lot of the news that we're getting down here is that in the United States, like, COVID is cured. Like, the United States is free at last, and everyone can take off their masks and go about their lives. How true is that?
That's that's been very interesting, especially here in the city. We've seen places reopen quite a long time ago, like as early as last fall, in terms of like retail and bars and things like that, with varying degrees of social distancing, or like, let's do this outside, or what have you. I've been vaccinated for like a couple months now. First of all, as soon as Governor Inslee said, all right, teachers are going to be back in the classroom in like 2 weeks, it was like, boom, I just had an appointment to get a shot. And so things moved quick, and the vaccination rate here, especially in the Seattle area, is quite high. But yeah, me and my journalism kids, we were looking at like 3 articles over the last couple days of class, and it's like, one of them says, it's from an MIT report, 6 feet of social distancing.
I saw that report. Yeah.
It's not enough. It's nowhere near enough. In fact, in an enclosed space, any amount of distance is probably not enough.
Yeah.
Just because of the nature of airflow and how circulation is going to get to you. So we looked at that, and we looked at, of course, CDC says if you're vaccinated, consider it safe to go maskless indoors now if other people are also vaccinated. Um, and then we looked at, sorry, it was 4 articles. These were all in interesting different ways of looking at this. The next one got into how our numbers for being outside and the infection rates when being outside have kind of been misrepresented, but in a way that you might not expect. They've said fewer than 10% of contacts between people outside without masks and stuff like that have resulted in COVID transmission. The actual number is fewer than 0.1%.
Oh my God.
It's a
So-
vast
So
different.
outside transmission is
extremely negligible. Like
Okay.
being outside is like the safest thing. We've also noticed this incidentally through contact with the homeless community. And like I can think back to just December, and I mean again going back into things we've had concerns about. There's a sweep of a homeless camp that was in Cal Anderson Park in December, and people were just like, I just want a place to walk my dog, whatever. There's so many places you can walk your dog, and you know they just like tore up hundreds of people's stuff, you know, dumpstered all of their things just in time for Christmas. Like, surprise, we got you nothing. In fact, the opposite of getting you something, we took all your things. And like, so that was a day of being involved in protest, mostly helping homeless people move their things to another encampment, and spent a good amount of time talking to folks that day. It was really interesting to discover many of them said, yeah, we haven't had COVID. Like, people I know haven't gotten it. Like, we don't think it's fake. Like, we're wearing masks and stuff. Like, this is like, it's real. This is real stuff. But yeah, it just hasn't been happening to us because we're outside. And so that was like an interesting piece. And the last article that I'm like making this reference to is just the kind of jagged profile of the United States, and like how reopening really fast in some places like the South has gone like really poorly. How a lot of places still are it's a little rocky. Some places, pretty much Seattle, San Francisco, are doing like really, really well. People are still nervous. Like, I have colleagues and I have students who are really uncomfortable with that CDC statement about no masks. I mean, I'm going to be wearing a mask for the rest of my life, pretty much. Like, I take public transit, may as well. Today, I was just like walking around and enjoying the day, and I made so many weird facial expressions that, like, man, I can't imagine being in public and not covering my face. Like, how else am I gonna like do everything dumb with my nose or my lips that I need to and be a public person if I don't have a mask on?
Yeah. Recently I've been walking a lot because I gained some weight and I need to undo that work. So like around my neighborhood here are a lot of bars and restaurants. Mm-hmm. And for whatever stupid reason, São Paulo opened recently and allowed people to have indoor dining. And
really open.
What's that?
Like really open.
Like really, really opened.
Like things are normal.
Yeah.
It's weird.
It's dumb. And usually when I go for these walks, I don't wear a mask outside. I just haven't been wearing a mask outside. But when I walk near these restaurants, I get like a panic attack seeing all of these people together. And there's so many people congregated, and it's like on the first floor of you know how it is on the corner, and it's open, right? And so I can just imagine all of this virus coming out of the restaurant at me, and I'm almost afraid to go near these places, even with a mask. So yeah, I don't know what I'm gonna do after all this is over about masks, because It's the habit has been built into me now.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I don't know what's going to make me feel like I'm comfortable going to a restaurant indoors. I'm not sure what point I'm going to step out of my house without a mask in my pocket at all. Even if I do, also, like, if I'm walking around and there's nobody particularly near me, sure, you take it off. I mean, that's been within the recommendations from Dr. Fauci for a while. It's something that all the science points to that is an okay thing to do. And it's interesting because like you get like a sense of guilt from doing things like that at times. But also there's evidence saying that like that's okay. The fact that they can say, well, it is also okay to go inside of a bar and take your mask off and hang out in there and laugh and shout with tons of people, and we have like a bit of cellophane between the tables, and we're going to pretend the air will like stop and then just like
or the vent above your head is not recycling the air from the people's table on the other side of the room,
right. And like I think like for some people that is like the checks on the boxes, I feel safe enough. That's not, and to me, I'm like, it's not again about personal safety at this point, because like I said, I'm vaccinated, but it doesn't seem like the responsible decision to make yet. And I still don't know what it's going to be. Of course, the classroom is like essentially an unsafe space now in this way at present, and perhaps I'm quickly transitioning us toward the.
No, I was going to ask you next about that, because the last time we talked, you were starting, I think, to do like remote learning. It was the schools had been it had been the summer, so there was no classes.
Yeah.
And then you were coming back, and we're gonna try to do remote learning.
Yeah, if it was.
And
August.
how did that go? How was remote learning for you?
There were the ups and there were the downs to it. This has been an extremely, extremely difficult year. It went through very different phases at the school in terms of how it would feel. From like the parts where it was like, all right, we're hitting this with everything we got. We're going to try to adapt as well as possible, to all the points that we realized, oh, it can't be done. Like the exact thing that we think we're doing is actually impossible. And I'm saying this with like all the circumstances of what is it that public school offers, that what is it when you have a school of more than 1,000 students, when you have 160, 170 students personally yourself, like what it means to give them your time and your energy over a school year. All of these things were really difficult. How an organization works, how people get along. We've had some like really, even knowing that there's like no crossover between like my local school community and like your viewership, like there's things I can't talk about, because like we had some real bad stuff happen at my school.
But I imagine that there was a lot of difficult things, drama, and mistakes that were made that it's best just not to talk about. But what are some things that maybe you learned over the last year, either about yourself or about maybe about yourself? That might be the easiest one to answer, you think?
Wow. Well, I do a lot of reflecting, so I'm like prepared to say like professionally and personally, different things. And initially, so I was transitioning to talking to school there, because like that is we were talking about like what's it feel, lots of people in a public space and that kind of thing. With regard to neighborhoods, we have about 400 kids coming into the building every day at this point, of total school population of 1025. 762 said we want to do in-person learning, and half of them can be in the school at a time.
Okay.
So that's what it looks like.
How do you think that's going to go? Do you think it's going to go well?
We're about 4 weeks into it, and
Yeah.
so it's been interesting. But let me rewind. We got to take this.
Yeah, go back. I'm curious about.
So first, briefly, like the personal. I mean, I've started seeing a therapist this year, and so I've been a bit more intentional about reflecting on my own self and mental state and what I do and how I balance my needs. And that is a lot of what led me to the decision to sort of pull back from a lot of school responsibilities that I used to have. You know, I serve on committees that deal with the budget. I serve on committees that deal with staff training. I serve on the race and equity committee. I help develop the school assessment plan for how good is your school doing. I've had my hand in so many different things, and went through some serious burnout when mostly when those things were not working out, and no amount of effort could make things work. Understanding where your boundaries and where your limits are has been a really huge thing, and it has been really good to explore that, and recognize where work ends and where I am from there. So that's been a really big piece of this year. And as much as it sounds when you describe things in this way, it sounds like a defeat kind of, it's no, it was a great success finding out that I needed space. In terms of learnings, so it's some general things about education. During hybrid learning, the way that our daily schedule worked with teaching a 6-period day to students, typically teachers have 5 classes that they teach in that space, and then 1 prep period. What our schedule is is that students would have an hour on, synchronous lessons, video chat, all the stuff that you do, and then they'd have an hour off, and that was called asynchronous time, and that's typically when they would do their homework. Everything is homework right now, of course. But that's if you would read or write independently. You might work in a small group with other students, or you might just send chat messages and emails to your teacher to ask about things. And then you'd have another class period, and then you have another asynchronous time, and so on. That format works better than the 6-period day. I have no idea how we learned anything when it was go to class, 5 minutes off, go to class, 5 minutes off, slam your lunch down your throat, go to class, go to class, go to class. How did you live? You'd see hundreds of people surging past you. Everybody's losing papers all over the place. It was nuts.
And the attention span of the typical kid having to deal with all of these different changes in attitude, changes in focus during the day, and keep it all straight. No.
And so the flexibility of that hour of asynchronous time was really good in lots of ways. So here's one. Obviously, people weren't working the whole time during an asynchronous period. If you just had a really eventful hour of face-to-face class, needed time to sit and reflect about it, that's great. Take that reflection. If it's just harder for you to focus and you just need to run around your house or cool down or something like that in between your classes, and then you do your work later in the day, you have that choice and agency. Here's the other side. If you're a person who can really go nuts and overdo it on an assignment, and you're frustrated and you just keep going, you have just an hour of that frustration before you move to the next thing. So it was really flexible. The thing that we saw the greatest improvement for is in how well English language learners and special education students were served. Almost beyond belief, those were the students who did best in my class over this last year. And it was because the pacing of the normal education system doesn't give them time to do the processing and to like figure out the steps that they would need. Many students who have learning difficulties are extremely interested in doing well in school, but it's external factors that prevent them from doing so. Giving them a chance to like kind of have their own choice board of how to deal with their stuff in between each class, it just helped them stay caught up and take care of everything they needed to do. And like they had all the access to their teachers in that time to ask more questions.
That's
Where things
interesting.
go. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that's interesting. And Rodrigo, you have more experience and actually some training that I don't have when it comes to language learning. Can you think of any reason why this would be the case for learning a language? Why the English language learners were the ones that
I think John said it. It's quite simple. You give them when you learn something, you need the learning time, and you need some time to process what you've just learned, especially a language. You can't just learn like when students have a 6-period day straight on, then they get a lot of input all the time for 6 hours straight, and they have to at the same time process the new language, process the new subject they're learning, maths, science, and everything else, English, reading papers, and so when you give them an hour, I forgot I forgot the word.
Asynchronous, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Asynchronous.
Okay,
Yeah.
so when you have an on hour and then an off hour, you give them time. It's like what we do with students, Ryan. We have a class with a student, an hour class, and then we give them homework. So now, right after the class, if you can do your homework, it will still be fresh in your mind. So they have some time to process, to think. I have a question for John. Um, when comparing the on and off way that you did this year and the 6-period day straight on, doesn't that also mean that in a 6-period day, how can I explain that? Like some classes are hard. You have like, did anyone get to that conclusion? After an hour of studies, like the other hour, not exactly an hour, but after some time, you have 5 minutes of break, but the other hour, the next hour might be, if you had a difficult lesson, you had a math class, then after the math class you have an English class, then you say just, your brain can focus because you're still connected to the math class.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's how it's been. I think like we just don't have a lot of flexibility around it, and so like people just say stuff like, oh, well, it's 6th period, so can't really expect much out of them anyway. Like people will just say things like that are like dismissive or like surrendering almost about aspects of the day. Oh, it's after lunchtime, they're just going to be like totally nuts then, there's no way to have good behavior after lunchtime, which isn't true. Neither is 6th period's just going to go bad because it's the end of the day. Neither of those things are true, but they're like common beliefs among teachers, which points to a problem. It points to an issue not with the professionals, not with the children, but with the system that we're working within. Like one thing I've been doing for a couple years now is yoga. Speaking of doing stuff to keep down things that develop, and there is a really important part to yoga that you can neglect: shavasana, the part at the end where you just lie down. You really have to take that time. It's not strictly cooling down the muscles, it's also feeling them. it's also like noticing in your body, oh, that part of tension is still there. So I probably shouldn't lean too hard on that arm or that leg. Oh, that, I still got like a little crinkle in that spot. It lets you know what you need to attend to. In the same way, having that reflection time after a lesson helps you understand, okay, I still have this thing I need to learn. It helps you get a grasp on what you do know. And then you have an understanding of where you are. That self-assessment that helps you understand how to guide your own study. I think that was something that was like really present. Um, so yeah.
Do do you think what do you think the plan, or what do you think administrators or the people in charge will do going forward? Now
They're
that
just go
are
back
they
to
just going to go right back?
that's the pessimism I have about everything.
Yeah.
Is that there's been very little reflection on the part of people who make the decisions. That choice to go back to schools very, very suddenly was such a shock for parents, students, everybody. And there are people who are just like, all right, we got our chance, we can do this. But like it on the level of like what it did for students in their communities, all of a sudden all the things that they did in the schedule of their day during asynchronous time, working with each other, was now impossible. We've created the new commuting period of the day in which everyone's trying to eat and get to the school as fast as possible. The new schedule is all 3 of your classes of the day, like before, but back to back with just 5 minutes between them in the morning.
Yeah.
Then 45 minutes to travel to the school, and then you have all of your asynchronous periods in the afternoon with part of your class at a time. Now,
That's ridiculous.
it sounds crazy, but like we first had to think, what are the goals here? One, every student has to have access to the lessons. So if you're only teaching, that small proportion could go into the school, no one else is getting the lesson, right?
Now,
So
I understand, like, but it seems like they're trying to make a what's the expression? A square peg fit a round hole. You know, they've already decided on the end, and now they're like, all right, how can we get there? How can we get to this end point that we've already decided on without taking any of the current situation into account?
Yeah, it was disastrous. There's lots of good things that have come of it. It's been really great to like have kids in the classroom there, to have laughter, to have interactions that they didn't get to have. But if you were like a kid who's at home right now, you are like, what's everyone doing? I wish I knew. They feel like really, really isolated.
Yeah.
There's no time really to ask teachers questions anymore the way there was. And cramming all of your reflection time together at the end of the day is no way to do that.
It's more like a nap than a reflection time.
Yeah, and it's so weird because nobody knows what they're supposed to do. The policies around it are very unclear and very contradictory. Like, initially, if students could attend the morning session, and they're supposed to attend the afternoon one, but they can't go, they would be marked absent. And if you think about it, it's like, okay, but the morning lesson is where the lesson happens. The afternoon is just work time. Yeah, the morning lesson doesn't count as them being present. It's just the afternoon. So they're marked absent.
Yeah.
It like every and like others have asked, like, okay, well, can we require students to show up during the afternoons? Maybe. Some teachers can say you have to show up in the afternoons, and some are saying, no, it's only optional. You don't have to come then. Which is what I'm doing, because some of them still have like obligations and things. Like one effect of the schedule, I guess I'm getting real deep into just like venting my grievances about my schedule here. But the school day is now much longer because they had to build in that commute time in the middle of it. And so it's like, if it's 4 p.m. and kids have been like going to baseball or gymnastics or something like that time all year, now they can't access it because they have to, do school day stuff. So it's just it was hugely disruptive. And again, with all of my involvement in different kinds of committees, it was extremely frustrating to see that we could just do 2 weeks and decide, let's make 50,000 people completely
Explode
change
their lives. Your
just
life, boom. Okay,
yeah.
change.
You're a teacher, you have kids, great. Find childcare 4 days a week. You a student, like you have no idea like who these other people are and you've never been around them. Guess what? You're just gonna be hanging out with these folks for like 4.5 hours a day, and you know, also make sure that you can take care of your tests. It's just like suddenly everything went real fast. A friend of mine who works in software says that there's a strategy you use as a programmer or developer sometimes called move fast, break shit. Um, it makes more sense to just create products and like sell them and move them out there as fast as possible, whether or not they work, because that engagement is like really necessary. And that's what I feel like schools are doing, moving fast and breaking shit. And it's really frustrating with as many ideas that we had in the past where it was like, oh, isn't this a thing that we could do? Oh, no way, we gotta wait. We gotta do studies. We gotta like take time. You can't just change one class in the middle of the school year. That would be crazy. It
Make
was all
sure you
made up.
make sure you have a public comment and get a parent-teacher meeting and do a study, compare it with similar situations all across the country, and maybe in 5 or 10 years we can try this. Just calm down.
It was all just hand waving, because it turns out you can just change anything you want at any time that you want, and you don't even have to know anything about the consequences of your choices. You can just do it. It's cool. Go ahead. So
Consequences. Those are for other people. What are you talking about?
and they have been.
Yeah. So to make a comparison with what's been going on here in the schools.
Yeah.
In Brazil, I said, in São Paulo at least, that we had a grand reopening recently. And before that, the public schools had been closed, right, Rodrigo? Just basically, they still are.
Here in São Caetano, here in my city, they're still closed.
Yeah. So the public schools are just closed, and they're not doing anything. They're just closed. But that's in many ways not. It is very disruptive to the working class people, but to the large majority of people that the government cares about, it's not disruptive at all, because so many people here in Brazil do not use the public school system.
Right.
And it's a huge difference that I've noticed, where in the United States, the public school system is actually pretty good. And it's kind of weird because the United States has terrible public everything except for the schools.
That's not the only. That's not the only. No, it's not the exact issue. I'm very curious about this. Why American people, not you, John, and not you, Ryan. You'll understand the people I'm talking about. But why American people accept great public schools, but they call healthcare, a public healthcare system, a communist system, and they say that's horrible. And anything that you offer as public, American people, part of American people consider that, I don't know, offensive and horrible. That's communism. That's socialism. That should never happen. I don't know. It's weird for me to. I don't know why they accept public schools like this because it's just it's everywhere. It's very different from here. But they don't accept everything else. The, this is also strange. Sorry, Ryan. You can
No, no,
finish.
that's exactly what I was going to say. So you nailed it. It's a fascination. It's weird. And I'm just curious if you have any insight into this because I can't really answer the question. Do you, as a teacher, know why people are so like fiercely they want their public schools, but nothing else? Government, educate my children, but stay away from every single other thing that could be public.
I think it, I must be a good guest for you because you ask me really good questions. You name things that like these are specifically topics that I spend a lot of time with. And so the nature of public schooling in America is one that's very easy to take for granted, both in terms of what it does for the country and in terms of how it came about, because the ways that it came about were quite interesting and unusual when you think about it. We didn't really have public school before World War II, first of all. And that's one of those things I love to bring up whenever people say things about what's normal generationally in the United States. And they're like, every generation goes through, and it's like, okay, 100 years ago, about 40% of people had a high school education in the United States. 40%. These days, it is above 90% of people have an education.
Yeah.
At least it's the high school level.
I can say that my grandparents' generation, there are a number of people who couldn't read. Like,
yeah.
my grandma can, she's still alive, she can, but not amazingly. She can read, but it's fine. And her boyfriend only recently taught himself to read, and he's like 70. So that's definitely a generational thing for people who were born in 1940.
Yeah, and this is like what we have to recognize is like state, municipal, and federal responsibilities in this area. Generally, it was considered a municipal responsibility in the past. Your city is there to educate you. If you live in a small unincorporated community, maybe somebody's got a schoolhouse, but it's probably just a person who like says, yeah, send your kids over. And maybe you don't like them, and so your kids don't go to school. So starting with, World War II, the, New Deal, all that kind of stuff, we have like a movement toward infrastructure and systemic stuff. You also have like that great, fear of communism that comes with the end of World War II. And public schools fit a really important role there in that they keep kids occupied and safe so that parents can enter the workforce. You also look at pre-World War II, like the way that social structures are organized. Oftentimes companies would not employ individuals, they employ families. People can like sub in for each other. Your wife who, in sexist 1930s America is expected to be cooking all the time. If you're sick and you come down with something, you can send your wife to work for you one day. Or you know what? You can send your 12-year-old kid and they could probably do half as much work as you, but it still counts as something and you can recover. So individual employment and keeping kids in the school system was something that business was really behind. Like not behind as like planning it, but they were like, yeah, we can get behind that. We support that. We think that's really good. I would say another piece of what makes the US school system uniquely strong and in a lot of ways very just are the various laws that we passed following the civil rights movement. Not just laws about desegregation on the racial level, but this is also when Title IX got put into place, guaranteeing, that women have access to things in their education that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act came out in the 1970s and said this whole wide set of categories that like we would use rather unkind terms to describe people's mental or physical situation. These people all deserve an education, and like the school system has to adapt. I think that what the US school system does that almost no other place does is guarantee education to people with special needs. It is the most beautiful thing about our school system is that we are intentional about that. And rather than saying like, this is hard, we're not going to do it, we've created things that others have had to emulate because no one has done it the way that we do. As much as there's a problem of bad mental health and care for people who are neurodiverse in the United States, it is also where we have learned the most and have prioritized the most is in this country, those kinds of needs.
I think that, I don't know. If you had another thing, finish.
Oh my gosh, like you're getting me to, I'm like getting into like all these different things, but the flip side of this is that private schools are really popular in certain communities. And I mentioned earlier, like it's a class thing. I know a lot of folks who are from the Northeast, and they say, you know, if you're anybody, you go to private school. There is still like a notion that private schools are better. Like all of my kids assume that private school is better. I think that another great surprise is that private schools typically cannot pay teachers as much as the public school system.
Really?
Yes.
That's interesting. So like, when we were together at Seattle U, I think the only private school, like the only private school colleagues that we had there were people from the Catholic schools.
Yeah.
I cannot think of a Seattle private school, high school. What are there? What exists?
Oh my gosh. Well, there's UPrep, University Prep, which is quite well known. It's very popular. It's actually quite a good school, I would say. Most famously, we have Lakeside. That's where.
Oh, Lakeside is private.
Yes, that's where the. That's where Paul Allen. You know, it's like all the big name people go there. You know, these schools, these are places that cost, you know, $30,000 these days, probably close to $40,000 per year to go to. They're wild. There are a lot of interesting resources for learning about these things. Like there are some good New York Times podcasts that can give you a lot on this. Nice White Parents is one that came out over this last year that tells you a lot about the pressures, like these rigorous and highly competitive schools. Yeah. There was an article that came out very recently. It was like an expose on some Northeast schools that was like a really big deal. But on the other side of this, and here's my other big recommendation, is that there are places in the United States also that depend on private schools because the public school system does not work there. Most famously in New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina hit, they closed of their something like 130 public schools. They had to like immediately close about like 120 of them. And they like struggled to try to deal with it for a couple of months and then just gave up. So there is no, I think to date, there is no public school system in New Orleans.
Are they like charter schools?
There are charter schools.
Okay. So I was actually going to ask you about charter schools, and I was going to ask you, like every few years, every 5 or 10 years or so, there's this like movement to make charter schools a thing, and it doesn't ever go anywhere. It seems like there's this energy from somewhere. Let's make charter schools a thing, and am I wrong, or does it just keeps fizzling out?
yeah, that stuff keeps coming up, and I know that I'm always tooting the same horn, but it's like people saying, I think the market can drive things better than the government can, and they're wrong. And people just they keep thinking like we need to treat schools more like businesses. They'll be more efficient that way. And I just don't know why people keep wanting to do that. Um, it doesn't make sense. If people really are like, it would be space for several shows slash podcasts slash whatever to go through. How do we assess if a school is doing well or not,
Yeah.
and how do we like construct policies around that to make sure it can do better? Um, that topic, I can I can dish that stuff for ages. Uh, but like functionally, public schools work really well because they have tons of oversight.
Hmm.
There are so many stakeholders. There's so much transparency into like what goes on. The number of things that like if I did not record the notes of, like the things that you can just be that you can get in some serious trouble for are immense. Whereas private schools can just make decisions arbitrarily and they don't have to really report to anyone.
They have to
Um,
report to their clients, and their clients don't have to. They don't have to know anything, right? They can
and
totally
their clients,
bullshit them.
yeah, their clients can be completely frightening people. Let me see if I can find the one article about this one expose. Um, I might have to send
You
this
can
to you
send
at
it. You
some
can
other
send it
point.
later.
Yeah.
It's fine.
It was
Um,
great. This person describes all the ways that like parents would show up at 6 in the morning and like camp outside of like the teachers' offices to like complain about particular things. Just it's bad out there. And again, like I am not joking about the pay thing. My pay is very public.
mhm.
Everybody can look it up. I'm happy to just like say like I get paid about 65,000 a year, which is like that's pretty good.
Mhm.
Uh, it is toward the lower end of the teacher pay scale in the public school system, but I'm only 5 years in, so that's a thing. I have a friend who works at a private school very close to me in Seattle, and she gets paid 45, and that's how it is. It's an economy of scale thing in this
Yeah.
case.
Plus, I suppose I'm assuming that your benefits are better than hers.
My benefits are also really good. Yes,
Yeah. So.
city and state benefits are strong.
If you think about if you think about how it should work, public versus private, it doesn't make sense. But if you stop and think a minute about how it actually works, it makes a lot of sense
Yeah,
that
when
they
you
laugh.
start with yeah, like revenue sources and
Yeah,
things like that, it's like, oh, okay, I see why it works this way.
this is.
Yeah.
I remember watching something. Jason Biggs and his wife, they were preparing their daughter to have an interview. They live in New York, I think, to have an interview to get into a private school. Some lady from a private school was going to their apartment to interview their daughter to test. I don't know exactly the process. And that I said, what? They here in Brazil, if you have money, you don't you just pay and you get in a school, you know.
And
And
then they
they're like,
build a bigger school if they have too many students.
yeah,
Like
exactly. So if
one
you
of
want
the
to
one
get
of
in,
the biggest, best schools in São Paulo is San Luis, and they used to be like downtown, but they had too many students, so now it's near me. They moved San Luis to near me and built this beautiful campus that opened like just as COVID happened, which I found a little bit funny that they built this
and it's
multi-million dollar
we have
campus that they couldn't
uh,
use.
the schools that we have tests to get into or interviews are public ones here in Brazil. The good public schools, the very good ones, you have to take a test to get because there are not a lot of good public schools, technical schools or just high schools. There's not a lot, so the very good ones you need to take a test to get in. Uh,
Interesting.
and then a lot of children that were educated in the private system, because the private system schools are better here. A lot of children that were educated in the private school system, they get into the public schools and they take the place. They can pay, but they say, but their parents, no, no, I want to save for college. So you go to this great public school, but then there's a lot of people that went to public school and they can't get in because, so it's really messy.
Yeah. Ugh.
Wow. Well, something else that we talked about last time, John, was that like it's a weird thing that Brazilians can't quite wrap their heads around. That Americans don't really study grammar at school. And you are a language arts teacher, right? That's what you do.
Yes.
Which is the closest equivalent to like a language course.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. So I'm wondering if you have any examples of like something that you would use to teach grammar without actually teaching grammar. Can you think of an example of that, or what is it that you do exactly? Like, do you try to explain like how does this work in practice?
It's about feedback. Ultimately, it's about like being able to see student writing and give them feedback. I also like just in terms of how I see language. First, it's in terms of usage, not correctness. Language is appropriate in different ways in different circumstances. A quick answer to a quick thing calls for different, sentence structure and word use than for a long-winded explanation of something. And a lot of what we do is like smaller scale. Um, so, back in the olden times, a typical kind of class cycle would look like as you walk into the classroom as a student, there would be a writing prompt up on the board. During the first 5 minutes of class, everybody has to quietly write an answer from there. You then turn to the person next to you. You got 2 minutes to talk about the topic. Then both of you will turn to the people behind you. You got 2 minutes to talk as like a group of four about the topic. And then we come together as a whole group. Everybody raise your hand and you're like, okay, what do you figure out? And there's a lot of ways for people to reflect on their thinking throughout that. As people are doing that, I can walk around, look into people's notebooks, make little changes and adjustments to what they're doing. Most of the time, again, I'm not really concerned about the grammar that they're using at that scale. It is about how you express your ideas. When it comes around to more formal assessments, I might do something like toward the end of the week, give everybody a little half sheet of paper after we've had a chat or some kind of project or activity of doing things together. And it's write up a quick explanation of what we just did and why that taught you something. Everybody turns that in and I can look at it and I can just see across the whole set of students oh, people don't really know how to use prepositions right now. Let's do a thing on prepositions. And so we will actually do one day of a targeted lesson around something. And I'll just say I'm just noticing a lot of you aren't making it clear how the first part of your sentence and the next part of your sentence are coordinated together. So let's just think about a few ways that you can do that with prepositions. And I try to teach it as I noticed you used a thing incorrectly, and here's the tool that you want to have to fix the problem that you had, to keep your little car of an idea running, it's a here's how to fix your stuff. I think taking that attitude with it has typically been more helpful than being okay, class, in order to start doing things, you need to know all of this. It's actually a lot better if when you're in the midst of the conversation, you're in the middle of doing something that you can teach them one technique in there. and this is a little tricky within my department. Um, at my school, I'm pretty lucky to have like a fairly non-toxic set of people who teach the exact same topic that I do. We're the only group of teachers in the school who are as well aligned with each other as we are, which is to say, you bounced a kid from any of our classes and you're like, welcome to this new class, you would know exactly what you're doing because it's the same thing pretty much. There's differences between us. But this is one of the things that I disagree with the most. And I do, I think, a little bit more explicit stuff, whereas the others do a little bit more like spot check, going into people's notebooks and being like, okay, let me explain this idea. So, yeah, I think it is interesting that we don't. I think like a lot of it is also the generations before us, like even like Gen X was in this situation, did have like explicit grammar lessons.
Yes, very much.
Didn't learn anything from it.
Yeah.
So that's why we like backed out of that stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, like my parents remember having grammar lessons for sure.
And this is something that makes our job, Ryan and I and mine, a bit more difficult because our students keep asking us to learn grammar. They tell us very explicitly, how can I learn the language if I don't know all the grammar before? I said, how how can you know all the grammar? it's it's a lot, you know.
Yeah.
So we take usually in school we take that approach to learn how to communicate well. You have to learn grammar. That's how kids uh, get in touch with communicating in language. We learn how to speak, and then when you're 7, teachers tell you to learn how to communicate well, you have to learn all the grammar. And then we get crazy learning grammar for 12 years, and we don't
Yeah.
really learn.
Yeah, it's so hard. It lacks that kind of reflection, right?
Yeah.
This has been a major theme of our discussion. I think that, and I think English is just so big, and it is also so improv as well. And I think that that's a really hard thing to get across, especially to English language learners. Like, it can be really, really hard to explain that, yeah, we're actually making it up all the time. Like, that's actually a beautiful thing about English is you do that. It's what makes jazz beautiful, and it's what makes English beautiful.
It's poetic. Yes.
Yeah.
Something very simple that it's difficult for us to teach students. For example, teacher, why did you say started out and not started and not just started? I said, what is the difference? He said, I just started out, I don't know, something. And then can I say I just started? I said, oh yeah, but it's a bit different, but not really. It's the same, but not really. But that's the beauty in English. It gives, it's just a twitch in the meaning or in the intensity, what you want to say in the register. But that's difficult to teach.
Yeah. And I think you really only understand it with a lot of reading, right? And seeing how other people have used it. So, yeah. What are the sorts of things that like your students are middle schoolers, right? They're like 13, 12 years old?
So my 6th graders, mostly I teach 6th grade. They're 11 and 12.
11, 12.
But I also have 7th and 8th graders, so my kids get as old as 14 when I'm with them.
Yeah. What are some of the things that they read at that level? Like, what are some books or what? Like the things that you assign them to read. I'm sure that they read their own things, but what are what are the things that you tell them to read?
We read a lot of articles.
Okay.
First of all. So we read a lot of stuff that's very current, rather than having like a lot of um, books that are like stables that we use
Mm-hmm.
for teaching from. A lot of the year is nonfiction, um, and or personal narrative. Um, so like the biggest book that I teach in the sixth grade is The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. Um, and I read that when I was in middle school myself. It's pretty short. It's only like, I don't know, 120 or so pages, and like the pages themselves might not even have text across the whole thing. It's a series of short chapters and vignettes from the life of uh, Latina growing up in Chicago. Um, I would say that she's probably around 12 at like the start of the story, probably like 15 or 16 by the end of the story. Um, and it's like largely autobiographical as well. Sandra Cisneros grew up in Chicago. Um, and so there's just a lot of life experiences that are really relatable for the kids from there. We start off the school actually with a lot of stuff that comes across as video and audio. So, are you familiar with The Moth?
The moth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a lot of
Uh,
recommendations here.
Rodrigo has a phobia of moths.
Ah, um, The Moth is a storytelling thing um, that occurs, and so um, the idea being like we storytellers are like moths, like clustering around a light or something like this. Um, but the way it used to work is that everyone who wanted to come to be part of the audience had to come with a short written piece, a story from their life, based around some theme that the evening was supposed to be about. And everyone puts their name in a hat, and then they just draw the names out of the hat, and anybody might have to tell their story that night.
Mm.
It is a very popular podcast series, a very popular YouTube channel. It's in many different cities. They work with schools and do all different things. So we start out with a personal narrative, and we have the students write personal stories, um, just like what's in a thing that has happened to you that like helped shape who you are, like a memory that you like really can't let go of, or the things that you think about when you fall asleep at night, and that sort of things, like the big stuff. How do you express the big stuff? And we just hear tons of other people's stories, funny ones, sad ones, revenge stories, you know, like just like all kinds of different feelings, so that we get into, first of all, the idea that writing and speaking and language is about communication and expression. um, a book we started reading this year is called Tell Me Who You Are, by Winona Guo and Priya Volchi, and it's a lot like that. We use it during the same minute now. And it's kind of like People of New York. Um, like the two writers traveled across the United States and interviewed hundreds of people just about what makes you you, and they explore just like all these different identities. We talk to people of all different racial backgrounds, you know, people who are old, people who are young, people who are transgender, people who are living with disabilities. Like, you just get all these different experiences wrapped up in this book, and like everybody just kind of talks about like what makes them, you know, what makes them tick. What do they do? How do they get up every day? You know.
That's cool. That's actually a good idea for a class. I think I might
Yeah.
use that for my students someday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this book is really good. I highly recommend it.
So to wrap up, Rodrigo has some questions for you about Dungeons and Dragons, and you might think that this is totally out of left field, but I was actually just thinking about right now. You were talking about like personal narrative and being able to write and tell your story, tell who you are, right? And actually, I think it's very connected.
I agree. Yes.
And that a lot of times the best writers are people who spent a lot of their childhood being imaginative and playing these kinds of games. So anyway, Rodrigo, what what is it that you wanted to ask John about for Dungeons and Dragons? And for anybody who doesn't know, John is a huge nerd. He might be more nerdy than me. I think probably.
Maybe, very
I
likely.
think certainly actually. I'm like a
Cool.
base level vanilla nerd, and John is much more into it.
From the deep pits
Yeah,
of
exactly.
darkness
So
in which nerddom was crafted from the dark days before. Yes.
Ryan said that I'm a nerd too, but I'm for other things, right, Ryan?
mm-hmm.
Like
For like
music.
music or
Yeah.
film.
So, anyways, I'm not. I was the opposite of what Ryan said. No, I was a pretty imaginative kid. I wrote a lot. I used to write a lot. Um, but I never got in touch with fantasy. I
Mhm.
never liked Star Wars movies like or endless story. I think that's the name. Uh, or Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. I never connected with any of that.
Mhm.
I still don't know exactly why. I can't remember if something happened that I was never connected with that. And I remember I watched the cartoon Dungeons and Dragons, and I liked it, but it was just like I was a kid. I watched it. I didn't think about it. Some of my friends played uh, Dungeons and Dragons. They had the game. I played with them, but it was mostly for fun, like 3 times, and we made up names and we made up stories. But it's Brazil, so it was different. Um, and now that I'm a teacher, that I'm an educator, I know the power of being intuitive, teaching intuitively, and teaching my son, for example, now that I'm a father and an educator, teaching my son how to express his feelings. Maybe writing a story, maybe creating a character, maybe trying to personalize a character. I don't know. I don't know exactly how to put that in words, but I I think a lot about this, and I would like to get in touch with role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons. Ryan told me you're a big, not only a big fan, you're a dungeon master, and I said,
This is true.
"Whoa, my God." Okay, so I would like to hear from a dungeon master. If first, if you think this is really a nice thing to do with my kid, he's 6, by the way.
Mm.
If it's too early, and if there are games to attend to my needs, to my son's needs.
What a great question. I'm honored to be able to answer it and to have like this kind of influence on a young person's education. And also as much as like you are so excited about this. And I'm excited for you and for your son. So like you're gonna have a great time together with whatever it is that you end up doing. Because role playing in general is like a really broad thing that could be done for lots of different reasons. For self expression, you know, as like a competitive kind of game, if that is, I would say that's one of the most narrow ways in which people do have the activity. Um, and just as a fun thing, you know, to do and to spend time together with. Um, so yeah, I've been involved in this hobby for virtually my whole life. And as a kid, I would say I got into it a lot because I like to draw, and I would frequently find myself at bookstores where those Dungeons and Dragons books were, and I'd like flip through the monster manuals. I would just see these absolutely wacky creatures, and I just was like, "What are they?" And I would go home and like draw them myself and things like that. So much of it's still there for me. I still really like that side of things. But that opens up like the question about like genre and like role playing and like having a game where you sit down together like that. It doesn't have to be fantasy. Much of what's out there, the books that are officially made, um, are fantasy themed, but it's not necessary that that's how things go. Like we have a sort of science fiction game that my group does, and we play online like this, and have been doing so for the last year. Um, but there's people who could run things that are like, you know, Wild West themed if they want. There's people who run, you know, so that's a thing to consider from it as well.
Or like Mobster, if you want to do a mafia themed one, that's totally possible too.
Yeah. And there's tons of people who release game systems, and they're just like, you know, little books and stuff like that, about how to do this sort of thing. What I suggest most of all is a system called Dungeon World. And I'm looking at it across the room here. I got the Dungeon World book. And I don't even look at it anymore because a lot of what I do and run, like we just kind of, it's jazz. We just come up with this stuff on the spot. The official product, Dungeons and Dragons, as owned by the company Wizards of the Coast, in my opinion, is too complicated and numbers related for me in the year 2021. Once upon a time, I loved that stuff. I don't actually care about, like, if I have a +2 sword versus a +4 sword, things like that. Like, I'm not living that life anymore.
You don't need an Excel spreadsheet to understand your games. It's not necessary.
It's not my thing. And like, for some people that is a really important part of it, and like it is really fun, and I get it. And I play video games too, and so like those scratch my itch for like make the numbers go up, kind of things. But the thing about Dungeons and Dragons that's the best is you don't have to stick to the rules, and that it's an interactive activity and it's creative. So here's where it starts. This is like one of my favorite things from the Dungeon World book. And you could do this with your son at the age of 6, and you could do this with your son at the age of like 25, and it would probably still be fun. And this is how they suggest, if you're going to start playing a Dungeon World game, you do things. At the table, you have like a few different people there, and you start by drawing like a wacky shape onto a piece of paper, and that is like the first region that you've got. And you're going to decide maybe it's a desert, maybe it's a lake, maybe it's a forest. Then somebody else draws another shape, and it can even intersect with it, but it's like a different region. And you go around the table, and everybody comes up with these places. So it's like, oh, here's the forest of falling stars. Here's the, lake of eternal shadows. Like, you just come up with this in the moment. You don't have to know what it is yet, right? So you do that. Then you do a round of everybody places, like a site, like a city, or a tower, or a mountain, or something like that. Not as big, just like a one place. And everybody drops in there. And now you have this map at this table, and all of you have probably laughed about it a lot because you came up with some really silly names, and you bounced ideas off each other, and that was fun. Here's an important next step. Everybody takes a moment and they thinks, and then everyone comes up with rumors about these places. Rumors. So, like, I heard that the dead king showed up in the ruins in the forest. Oh, I heard that, and like, everybody comes up with these, and there you are. You are ready to now have a game, a quest, because you don't know if those things are real or not. And they're all going to turn out to be probably what you thought, but totally different as well. And so, like, I think that's what it looks like to have fun with that game. The reason I like that Dungeon World system is it's full of little things that are more like prompts for questions like that, whereas like traditional Dungeons and Dragons is more like,
math.
Yeah, it's lots of math. You get powers in Dungeon World that are much funnier, in my opinion. Like, you understand the whole essence of it being that, like, every time you say I'm going to do something, you roll a dice, and if it's high, then oh, you did do the thing. If it's low, you're like, no, you did not do the thing, right?
Yeah.
Problem with that, this is already getting a little deep into like, you know, gameplay and all these kind of things. But the problem with that is that telling somebody no, you didn't do the fun thing is boring. We want to be able to tell people.
You have to do like improv.
Yeah,
you have to yes and people.
Exactly. So Dungeon World is all about the yes and so it builds a lot of things into the system that I really like. You know, rather than, let's say, there's a locked door and your character rolls to see if they can pick the lock. It's super boring when you roll low and you just say to the player, like you would in Dungeons and Dragons traditional style, oh, the lock pick breaks, you can't go through the door. In Dungeon World, they would encourage you to say something like, okay, yeah, you pick the lock and you stumble directly through the door and like slam face first into a guard on the other side. What do you do? What happens next? So that's the stuff that is really fun. And like,
that sounds much better. You know,
Yeah.
One of the reasons that I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons is it didn't seem like fun. It seemed like math. This sounds cool. This sounds fun to me.
Yeah, it needs you to be more creative and intuitive. So that's why it's especially for a 6-year-old, a Brazilian 6-year-old kid. It sounds much better.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like even this book, it's like this big. It's got a ton of different things into it. I would say it's still probably really complex for somebody at that age, but the map thing isn't, and like that's a great place to start. I would say start with like doing like the map kind of thing, and then if you do ever find like books with pictures of monsters in them, I like to think that that's like that's a huge one.
Yeah.
As long as
like that.
Yeah, then there you go. Those are the seeds to.
But what about card role-playing games? Are they nice too? Like Magic, I think.
Oh boy, those are too hard for me. Again,
they're too hard for you. Then no.
My God.
No, the thing is like people, like I have a lot of kids who are really into playing Magic at school. It's never been quite. It's just doesn't scratch the right itches for me. Like, I like to be able to come up with things out of the blue, but like when you're working with a closed system, like there's cool things and combinations and unexpected interactions between cards, but like, I don't know, it's a different thing entirely, and
yeah. Did we lose John?
No.
I have lost
He's back.
you a bit. My connection is sometimes weird.
I think we're
can
mostly back. There we go. Well, one thing I would say is when I was about that age, Rodrigo, like 7, I think, one of my best memories when I was that age is my dad bought Wolfenstein 3D, and he got it and he played it with me, and he made it like an RPG adventure because like he was like, should we go around this corner? Should we take the elevator? He was letting me make the decisions, you know. And it was so much fun. It was one of my best memories from being a kid was murdering Nazis with my dad. So if you can find ways to encourage his creativity and imagination, and just do something with him, do an activity together that's imaginative, then 20, 30 years later, he'll remember it. I guarantee it.
That was precisely my idea when I thought that, and also incentivize him to have any contact with fantasy because
Hmm.
I feel that I missed something along the way by not now. For example, I can't connect with any. Like I tried to watch Game of Thrones. I saw a dragon. I said, no, that's not for me. My thing is like watching Woody Allen or Noah Baumbach in movies and like that, or reading philosophy books. I can't connect with any fantasy. So I would like Vito uh, to have that. It would be cool.
I think there's nothing wrong if you don't connect with fantasy, though, because like all the other things that you name there, like they're connected to the world in ways that are really important too. And I think that fantasy allows us to kind of play out things that maybe we're uncomfortable dealing with explicitly. Um, I think that you know fantasy is just usually a metaphor for other things much of the time, and like some of us want to use metaphors and some of us just want to like shoot straight. um, so I think that also it shouldn't necessarily be like a pressure, like that's a thing that has to exist there. Game of Thrones also did not turn out to be a very good show in the end, so it's like if you got like the inklings of it from the start, that like, yeah, this actually it's not going to go anywhere, then you just did a good job of paying attention to it. The rest of us missed that and lost
Yeah.
years of our life.
Yeah. So much misery in our lives because of that.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And to bring this back around to the whole like theme of the conversation about reflection,
Yeah.
like this, like fantasy, science fiction, fiction in general. Like when you reflect on it enough, you can really pick up on some things. Even like really silly stuff, like a really ridiculous RPG game that has no particular meaning to your life. Usually it does if you just take some
Yeah.
time to reflect. So yeah, that's all I got for now. Do you have anything else? Do you have any questions? We've been peppering you with questions all evening. Do you have anything you want to ask before we leave you for another time?
Goodness gracious. Questions off the top of my head right now at the end of this segment at the
Yeah,
sunset of this lovely
you
day.
don't need to.
Um,
It's,
It's not
no,
necessary. I just wanted
I'm
yeah.
to give you.
always I'm always going to be prepared to direct silly questions and that sort of thing out there. Um, so, if you had to have a mullet for the rest of your life, or you had to have a bowl cut for the rest of your life, which one of those would you choose, and why?
Well,
uh,
Oh, there
he's almost
We've got
there.
a mullet started, so the answer.
pandemic mullet.
Oh, I guess I would go with mullet too.
Yeah, that's great. Rock and roll.
Yes. Yeah.
Like an '80s mullet or a white trash mullet?
No, an
What?
80s mullet. Full
Yeah,
full regal
Full on.
mullet.
I
Yeah.
think that you'd have the room to like choose between either one of those. But yeah, we'll go with that for this
Yeah.
question.
Perfect, man. Well, thanks for coming back.
It's my
love,
pleasure.
Love to have you. And maybe we'll make it a trilogy here another 8 or 10 months from now. All right.
Yeah.
I would love to. It'd be great.
Cool.
And this will be a difficult one to top, right? That was
Yeah.
that was amazing again. Thank you.
Perfect again. So, yeah. Just like all the other trilogies, we're gonna ruin our 1, 2, and then that third one is just gonna send it
It's gonna go
right down
wild,
the
just
drain.
off the rails. It's
We
not
can
gonna
get
be
drunk for the
hilarious.
third one.
It's like The Godfather 1, amazing. Godfather 2, better. Godfather 3,
Yeah.
what are you doing, man? It's gonna be us.
We'll be better than that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for being here. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And see everybody next week. We got our friend Ronald from Jamaica. He's going to be with us. And so look for us next week. Thanks again. Adios, everybody.
Yes. Bye bye.
Thanks for being here.